Hello, today we'll be speaking with Kenneth Gould, a professor of sociology and urban sustainability at Brooklyn College. His interests and teachings focus on the political economy of the environment, the impacts of globalization and sustainable development efforts, and the role inequality plays in environmental conflicts. He has co-authored numerous texts such as Green Gentrification, Urban Sustainability, and the Struggle for Environmental Justice, which we're looking forward to discussing today, and so much more. We would like to begin by asking, what was your inspiration to become an expert in sociology, environmental sciences and justice, and green gentrification? Do you perhaps have a personal connection to the subject matter?
I think part of it comes of coming of age in Brooklyn during the dawning of the awareness of the ecological crisis in the late 60s and the 70s. PS 152 did something special for the first Earth Day. And following that, I wrote an essay, got involved in Save the Whales campaign. So it just kind of rolled. And then 3 Mile Island happened while I was in high school and got involved in anti-nuclear work. And when I went to college, I shifted gears and was focused on, Ronald Reagan's war on the poor in Central America and got interested in, third world liberation struggles. When I got to graduate school, I kind of combined those. I was looking at a sort of development, what we used to call third world development issues and environment issues, which eventually became something along the lines of sustainable development. So it's kind of a long, slow evolution. So I've been interested in environment and development issues with an inequality and power frame that became my intellectual work.
Moving on to your book, Green Gentrification, you discuss how increased environmental initiatives are great for the community, but ultimately end up displacing the working class and people of color. However, you also discuss that there can be preventative measures, such as certain policies that can mitigate this effect. Could you please summarize how these policies address the issue and how early on they may have to be implemented?
There's a range of policies available: community land trusts, zoning, being involved in zoning. Very often these gentrification initiatives begin with a rezoning initiative, fighting for affordable housing, not the creation of affordable housing, but the retention of affordable housing where it already exists. Things that are very unpopular with the city, like rent control, all of that. But I think the key thing is community organizing. Right? That is communities that are organized, that have a dense social network, that are well organized, that are focused on issues of community preservation, and even more importantly, that have a vision of the future of the community. Not only what is this neighborhood now, but what do we, as the people who live in this neighborhood, want this to be in the future? What's our future vision? Because having a proactive vision, I think, is very, very powerful. Very often these situations arise and people are reactive. You're trying to prevent a new condo development, you're trying to prevent a rezoning, and you have much more success, in my experience, if you're already working with your elected officials, pushing on your elected officials to realize a vision that's bubbled up organically from the community.
Well, following up on that, one of the ongoing ideas is that places like Brooklyn are too far gone, and there have been too many changes in terms of both economic changes and environmental development. So do you agree with this sentiment? Do you agree that there are places where it's too late to implement certain changes?
Once people are displaced, yes. There's no turning back the clock. So once Williamsburg is not going to be what Williamsburg was 30 years ago. You're never going to turn back that clock. There's been people have displaced, they have new lives, people are not going to come back, the people who live there are not going to be moved out, the condos won't be taken down, all the restaurants and hipster venues are not going to be removed. So yeah, I agree that there are places, once gentrification has happened, it's not going to come back. There are cycles, so there may become a future cycle of disinvestment, right, which allows places to become, re-inhabited by other people who are maybe working class. But you can't ungentrify, in my view. On the other hand, Brooklyn's not a monolith. Places like Williamsburg are not coming back, right? But there are places that are not gentrified. There are places, Sunset Park, which is a great example of a community that's well organized, has a good organization. If you're not familiar with Uprose, it's probably a really good model. It's a 50-year-old community-based organization that's helped develop a vision of a working class walk to work community with green jobs and green spaces. And it's probably been the most successful of any neighborhood in Brooklyn in sort of managing. It successfully fought a rezoning. It's been involved in discussions of rezoning. And so, I think Sunset Park is probably a good example of a place that would have been tremendously gentrified, and that has been mitigated by community organization. There are also parts of Brooklyn that haven't been gentrified yet. And I say yet, right? Because real estate capital is always looking for new investments. Flatbush, where I grew up around Flatbush Junction, you just see it starting now. I mean, I know that neighborhood for 60 years, and you're just starting to see new condo buildings going in. So it's an opportunity for that community, should be now organizing, developing its own vision, right? So it's not too far gone yet, but it will be in 5 years. East Flatbush still has opportunity, right? So clearly, but being organized before real estate capital starts coming around and seeing, oh, nice housing stock, is it near a subway? That's when you have to be ready to move.
Yeah, that kind of brings me to my next point. I wanted to ask more specifically about Washington Heights, which is what we're specifically interested in. I wanted to ask whether you think there are certain policies that can be implemented to prevent what happened in Brooklyn, but I imagine perhaps the scenario you described with Sunset Park would be a great model to follow to prevent such rapid change.
Yeah, I don't think it's so much, specific policies, because those policies, they have to be citywide, right? And so that's a matter of, approaching elected officials and again, it's very hard in New York City. I mean, New York City runs on two industries, right? Finance and real estate, right? You might have noticed, like a New York City real estate con man became president of the United States. He's trying to do it again, right? And so, real estate has a lot of power in this city. But I think community organizing is the key, right? Around, Washington Heights. My mom grew up in Washington Heights, right? Washington Heights, if you have an opportunity to do that now, and you also have a key gentrifier, gentrifying node, which is Columbia, right? And so you can, if you had a strong community organization that was in negotiation and conversation with Columbia University, you'd be in a better situation.
We read up on your treadmill of production theory and the discussion that you had about the constant search of new technologies and increased production of goods, and how that does not benefit economic growth as much as it causes immense environmental damages. So we would just like to ask in general, is there a solution or a way to decrease this treadmill of production? And does this theory apply to gentrified societies undergoing immense industrialization?
Okay, you froze on me, but I hear you're asking me about the treadmill of production. Yeah, I mean, the treadmill of production is basically, it puts, it shows the lie of the myth of economic growth, right? The benefits of economic growth are generally invested in labor-saving technology, which increases energy demand and decreases employment. So the idea of the treadmill, like, why is it a treadmill? It's because we have to keep running faster, but we keep staying in place, right? You might have noticed 40 years of economic growth didn't produce, a great increase in the wealth of the average American, right? And so you can ask yourself, well, we've had a lot of economic growth in New York City. Well, how come people are so, bad off in so many areas, right? And it's like, well, it's about the way the wealth is distributed, right? We have this obscene inequality. And when you think about environmental constraints, if you can't keep growing the economy because of the ecological costs, you can't keep extracting more and more resources and pumping more waste into the biosphere, like for instance, CO2 into the atmosphere, then you're going to have to limit that, right? And if you're going to limit your ecological withdrawals and your ecological additions, then how do you improve people's lives?
It's almost like demystifying this idea that people have about industrialization or rapid industrialization, how that's supposed to power economic growth.
Absolutely. I mean, if you think about how excited people get, the propaganda machine is very powerful, right? So when the stock market goes up, everybody's like, this is great news, the stock market went up. Well, 80% of the stock is owned by 20% of the population. So when the stock market goes up, what that's really a proxy for is inequality has increased. And yet everybody's excited that inequality is increased because it sounds like wealth is increasing, but literally the gap is increasing.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. It's all kind of about the marketing of certain terms and how they're presented.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's close to ideological hegemony. You won't see any politician, even the most progressive politician, making an argument against economic growth. Each one has a different idea of how to inspire economic growth or the right kind of economic growth.
Yeah, I imagine it would be faced with quite a bit of criticism if someone came up on a platform and started bashing economic growth.
Right. Really, what we need to do is shrink the economy so it fits within our ecosystem. And in order to keep people from being worse off as a result of that, we're going to have to redistribute wealth from the very rich to the less wealthy.
All right, so I think this relates to the next kind of line of questioning. We wanted to discuss your article on resilience gentrification, and specifically the link that you found between climate change-induced disasters and how the post-disaster recovery exacerbates existing housing inequality. So could you just begin by giving a brief introduction to the subject and perhaps defining the term resilience gentrification as you see it?
Right. Resilience gentrification. I mean, we're facing a number of resilience issues. I mean, certainly in New York City, it's coastal. Our issues are sea level rise, storm surge, more powerful storms, more intense precipitation events, right? And so, what are the logical things to do there? Well, I mean, if you have sea level rise and you're coastal, it might make sense for everybody to move back from, flood zone 1, right? The ecological logic says, well, if the sea is going to come up, then the city is going to have to come. So as the sea level comes up, it would make sense to step back from the sea, right? Transformative adaptation, managed retreat. But what that really means is giving up real estate to the sea. Right. And as I said, this is not a city that gives up real estate. I mean, we've spent centuries filling in, ocean, right? Marshlands, right? Building, landfill off of Manhattan and elsewhere, right? So we're always trying to create more real estate. And, nature wants to take some of that real estate back. And so the alternative then is to do a couple of different kinds of things, right? One is, some kind of, it's all structural mitigation. But one would be, say, lifting buildings, right? So you put them on stilts, you put the utilities on the roof, and that allows the water to come in during a flood, during a storm surge, and then flow back out, right? So that allows the buildings to stay. So you protect the utility of using that real estate, even though it is going to flood, and you don't wipe people out, the buildings don't get destroyed, what have you. But that increases building costs. Right. So this is going to be more expensive to build. And if it's going to be more expensive to build, it's going to be and more expensive to maintain. It's going to be more expensive to buy and more expensive to rent. So that's going to change who can afford to live there, buy there, rent there. Right. And so that is a gentrifier in and of itself. Right. It says, oh, well, if you can't afford, raising a house, might be cost $40,000-$50,000. It's expensive. And who's got $40,000-$50,000 to do that? Well, the people who have that will stay, and the people who don't will get wiped out, or they'll leave and be replaced by somebody who can. And so the shoreline becomes richer, and because race and class are tightly coupled in the United States, it becomes whiter. Another alternative is, to build seawalls and just sort of hardening the shoreline, right? Building like they're doing in Rockaway, putting in seawalls, building higher dunes, all of this. It's all that's public investment, right? Private investment, right? That's when private developers and individuals are increasing construction costs. But when you're building a seawall, hardening the shoreline, those kinds of things, that's usually public investment. That's the Army Corps of Engineers, that's federal money very often, right? And so that's our tax dollars being used to protect these areas that we should probably be withdrawing from. But when you build that, right, when you put that in, it encourages development behind it, right? Because now, oh, well, if the government's going to invest all this money in hardening the shoreline, protecting it, well, I feel I feel good investing as a developer in a development in this place. And what that tends to do is to move more and more people. So you then densify flood zone 1, right? The place where I'm saying it would make sense for people to withdraw from, you're moving more people in there, right? And we see that all over the city, right? We see people like moving increasingly to, flood zone 1, which puts more people at risk. How that's going to play out, I mean, I do not believe we will be successful at holding back the sea forever, right? But once you've invested that money and you've got more development behind it, then the government field is obligated to create more investment in holding back the sea to protect that new investment. And so it becomes, sort of a downward spiral of, holding back the sea and densifying the population in the riskiest, most precarious locations in the Anthropocene.
I mean, I'm noticing quite a little bit of irony in these things. So it doesn't really matter if it's private investment or public investment, directly or indirectly, it causes the same result.
Right. I mean, it does tend to play out the same way. I mean, technically, if you harden the shoreline with public investment, you could also create, public housing behind that.
And then
Right?
ironically, as people are supposed to be moving out of those areas, more people are moving into those areas.
Absolutely. And also when you rebuild, like the rebuilding in the Rockaways, I mean, when you rebuild a very nice boardwalk that's also a seawall, right, then that becomes an urban environmental amenity. Right, it's public space, it's very nice, it's beautiful boardwalk, plenty of parks, like it's very, very nicely done, but that's going to also attract gentrification.
So I found a particular conclusion that you reach in your article quite interesting, and was wondering if you could elaborate on it. I'm going to read it. It says, resilience gentrification, especially in the global south, is in some ways a greenwashed version of neo-settler colonialism. Could you elaborate on this?
Sure. I mean, in some ways, I mean, gentrification is not unlike settler colonialism, right? I mean, if gentrification is the appropriation of value of a place by one group from another, I mean, and they appropriate that value by living there, that's, settler colonialism, right? I mean, we displace a population, a new population comes in, uses those resources, appropriates them for themselves, right? And so, I mean, that's largely what this is. I mean, if you look at a place like Gowanus, right? I mean, Gowanus, which is amazing to me, right? Because when I grew up, I mean, Gowanus, we used to threaten to throw each other in the Gowanus Canal, which meant you would die, right? And now it's been, redeveloped as waterfront property. Well, there was a working class community that lived in Gowanus, right, with a lot of light industry in Gowanus and jobs, right? And now that was then appropriated, right? They built a Whole Foods, a sustainability theme Whole Foods there, just to make it extra ironic, right? And they basically said, well, now we're taking this waterfront. We're going to clean this up now, and this is waterfront property, and we're taking it for us. It's the group that I call the sustainability class. Right, the people who have a certain environmental consciousness to the extent that they want urban environmental amenities, right? They want to feel closer to nature, connected to the environment, which is a good thing, right? And they also have the wealth to do that. And then they become, the market for, things like a sustainability themed Whole Foods in Gowanus.
So you could actually compare Gowanus to the Caribbean islands of Bermuda. And I wanted to ask about certain differences that you perhaps noted, or more importantly, some similarities, because I feel like there's post-disaster recovery all over the world. And it would just be interesting to note some similarities in these processes.
Sure. I mean, the differences, I mean, one of the reasons that we wrote that is it's interesting because the differences are extreme, right? One of the interesting things about Barbuda is all the land was communally held. So they had a different land tenure system. There wasn't private land. You couldn't buy land or sell land, right? And of course, that was changed after the hurricane came through. And the government moved quickly to abolish that and make it and to start selling off this land to private developers. I think when you think about what a disaster can do, I mean, a disaster can do two things. It could do, what we call climate demolition, right? It removes it removes buildings, it destroys buildings, a clean slate, right? And so now you've got this area, like you don't have to displace people, the storm displaced people. Now the people are displaced. Now you have to make, stringent rules for how we rebuild here, because you don't want to rebuild. And it's logical, right? It's not, it's not evil, right, to say, oh, if we're going to rebuild here. When I talk to people in Barbuda after the storm, right, people say we need to rebuild with concrete. We need to, we need to have, it makes sense. But when you do that, you raise the cost, just like I was talking about. So when you do resilient building, you tend to make it more expensive. So who can rebuild and who can't rebuild changes. In the case of Barbuda, you have a different kind of displacement, which is people are displaced, and then international tourism capital comes in and says, hey, why don't we develop this beach, right? We're going to turn your beach that was community held property into privately held or privately leased property that's now going to be the playground for, the global elite. And it'll be ecologically themed, it'll be green themed and all of those things. But it is, again, an appropriation, it's the expropriation of place.
I imagine it must be really hard to protest these issues because people feel very strongly about the climate, and obviously everyone wants to be ecologically sustainable, but then it poses a question of at what cost and where.
Right, and we can become ecologically sustainable. I mean, we're not, climate change is here. It's coming for at least another couple hundred years. It's just going to get worse. If we stop using fossil fuels tomorrow, it will get worse for 200 years probably, right? And we're not stopping, we're loading more greenhouse gases in the atmosphere than ever before. So things are bad, and they're going to get a lot worse. And that's just the reality. Now, you can dedicate, what if you committed money instead of to building, there's now a proposal for a $53 billion set of seawalls. I don't know if you saw that, to wall off New York Harbor and, adjacent, waterways, $53 billion. What if you use $53 billion to build low-income housing, affordable housing in flood zone 2 or 3 away from flood zone 1? Right, that would be a different approach. What if you bought people out? And it's controversial to buy people out. People don't necessarily want to leave. I mean, I understand people don't want to leave their neighborhood, even if it's threatened by climate change. At some point, the sea will tell you, will take you out. What if we buy people out at 150% of market? Right, buy people out at a level in which they can afford to buy and move somewhere else. So there's different ways of spending that money. So it's not that, addressing climate change necessarily is bad for the poor and working class. It's the way we approach climate change in a capitalist society that's necessarily bad for the poor and working class. Right? Yeah. There are equitable ways to do this.
Yeah, that actually brings me to my next point, because I wanted to mention that you suggest that there is a way that governments could aim to consider equity behind climate change resilience policies. And one of the suggestions that you propose is the degrowth strategies that will prove to be beneficial to create that just sustainability. So I was wondering if you wanted to talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, degrowth, the long run, we talked about that earlier, right? Which is, economic growth increases ecological costs, right? And we live on a finite planet. So you can't grow something forever in a finite system. Put a goldfish bowl on the table, that goldfish, if it just keeps growing, will eventually outgrow that bowl. You'll have a broken bowl, a lot of water, and a dead fish, right? And so, you can think of our economy like that. But everything doesn't have to serve that. That doesn't mean you can't have a high quality of life, right? We've been using the concept of economic growth as a proxy for improving quality of life, right? That is, people think, oh, that's how I improve quality of life. And despite lived experience, as I said before, people have lived through experience of long periods of economic growth, and people aren't better off, right? And so that's not necessarily the root. So part of it is again, like I said, at the community level, at the very local level, you have to have a vision of what you want your community to look like. What do you want the economy to do, right? I mean, what are people looking for? Do we want to, have more and more money, or do we need to create more and more wealth, or we just need to distribute that in such a way that everybody's basic needs and some of their wants are met, right? Do we have homeless people and people with 3 houses, right? That seems like a problem that's easy to solve, right? I mean, that's not terribly complicated. But also think, what would people like other than more money to buy more stuff and have more things, right? Which is bad. People like, time. What if you were making the same amount of money you had, and you had a 4-day work week, right? What if you had more time for family? What if you had more, more opportunities for community engagement, right? It's not, quality of life and wealth are not the same thing, right? But we've been led to believe that they're at least closely related, which is not to say, like, if you're poor, you need more money. Yes, you do, right? Right. That is absolutely the case. But at some point, we've seen at a certain point, sociologists seen that at a certain point, more wealth doesn't get you more happiness. It gets you more stuff, but not more happiness.
I mean, it seems blatantly obvious once you put it that way that New York City has been experiencing economic growth for God knows how long, but the quality of life has been pretty stable and pretty low.
Right.
So it seems very obvious and it seems like an easy problem to tackle. It's just pretty pessimistic to think that it's not being addressed.
Right. Well, I mean, it's about power, right? I
Yeah.
mean, who gets, nobody's quality of life is being improved by all of these, pencil towers going up,
Yeah.
on the south end of Central Park, right? Nobody's quality of life. Even the people who live there, those buildings are pretty bad. If you read the stories about them, I mean, they're prestige buildings, what have you. But that all shows up as massive economic growth, right? I mean, we tally that as economic growth. I mean, the other problem is that when it comes to the economy, we only tally benefits and no costs, right? I mean, climate change, what if when you burn fossil fuels in order to generate wealth, the loading of the fossil fuels into the atmosphere is not counted as a cost, right? So it looks like we're generating wealth. Well, the loading of the CO2 into the atmosphere is creating all kinds of costs, like $53 billion to build a seawall, right? To build a sea gate, right? But that doesn't, somehow we calculate that as something else, right? If you internalize all of the costs of the production system, you'd see a lot of things don't make any sense, like plastic water bottles. I throw it out and then, and I pay taxes to have that hauled away. And then when they burn it, because recycling doesn't really happen that much, when they burn it or bury it, that affects my health. And then I pay the health costs of that. But none of that, if you included that in the cost of the plastic bottle, it would be, expensive thing and nobody would buy that. Just everybody think it's stupid. We have the best tap water in the world in New York City. Why am I buying bottled water?
It's so incredibly cyclical when you put it that way that say burning more fossil fuels to create more economic growth causes more disasters to occur and then causes more projects such as, the wall, the 53 billion wall, which causes more gentrification, more displacement, lower quality of life.
Right. And then the answer is, well, how are we going to pay for all of this seawall construction and all of this, all this stuff? How are we going to pay for dealing with climate change? We have to grow the economy.
All right. So just moving on to just prospects for the future. In your opinion, what would be the best way for, say, students like myself or other people that are feeling passionate about this subject to get involved with anti-gentrification efforts or other efforts that are related to gentrification?
Creating awareness is good. I know you've put together a website. You have to be working with people who live in the community. I mean, I know there's Columbia students, who are, visiting like college students are, and then there are people. So it's organizing with, right, and listening to. There's a lot of listening. Right. I mean, nobody wants a bunch of, highly motivated, well-meaning college students coming and telling them about their community.
Yeah.
Right? Nobody ever wants that. Right. But I'm sure that there are community organizations that you could work with and talk to about what are people's concerns about gentrification, right? What are people's fears? And start to help people to realize, to understand what their own vision of what they want their community to be like, right? So there's, college students can help in this by helping to empower and give voice to people who are, have less access to resources and privilege, right? So you can harness some of the resources that you have access to as Columbia University students, right? And make those available to the community, right? And that's a powerful thing. And it's not just Columbia. I mean, this is, University of Chicago, University of Illinois, Chicago, University of Chicago. I mean, these are all, these institutions, NYU, they're all, gentrification engines because they're, centers of capital. And they have those impacts on neighborhoods everywhere.
Yeah, it's definitely such a dilemma because I completely agree that this needs to be a thing where it gives power to people who are actually experiencing these things. And then it also comes with such a dilemma because I am part of an institution which is the primary gentrifying agent in a neighborhood.
You can't avoid those contradictions. You're embedded in a society. Just because you understand it and you disagree with aspects of it doesn't mean you can float above it.
Yeah.
I am part of the United States of America, even though if I don't like the policies that it had in Latin America and Central America in the 80s. You know what I mean? So it actually it obligates you to do something about Columbia, right? So that the extent that you have access to Columbia administration, Columbia Board of Trustees, right? Columbia endowment, right? Columbia is a player and Columbia can use its capital to help protect a neighborhood too, right? So, where students can be a force is in putting pressure on the institution that you are a legitimate member of, right? And you will have your voices received differently than the voice of the neighboring community who are outsiders to the institution. You're an insider to the institution.